Following the G20 London Summit of April 2009, CIGI and Chatham House jointly produced a briefing paper on the unfinished agenda of the G20 process. It laid out a set of reforms, both substantive and organizational, that could help strengthen the capacity of this process. In this final video, we've asked workshop participants to reflect on whether there is an unfinished agenda of the G20 and how this process can sustain its momentum as the crisis subsides.
I think we're very much in between. I think as a crisis committee, the G20 has to be given full marks. I mean, certainly in terms of the initial stimulus package, both nationally and internationally. This was sort of a very much of a collective endeavor. And again, through the Washington meeting, through the London meeting, this was a success story. The other component, I think, sort of coming out of crisis, of course, the talk about exit strategies, I think sort of play into that feeling that the G20 is a crisis committee. The sense of exiting, certainly shows that you're coming into a recovery and that you have to sort of unwind. The big question, though, the big puzzle, of course, is whether the G20 is or has moved to being a steering committee. And of course, in some ways it has. Just the fact that it is a reflection of both the older powers, the G7, G8 members, plus this sort of constellation of countries, emerging powers, rising states, new countries. I mean, this is important. Plus, of course, the sense that it's not only a club, but that it's a network as well, a network enhancer, where international organizations are brought into play, and certainly sort of in some ways subcontracting some of the work out to the FSB, out to the IMF. This is very important, I think, in terms of not only the technical work, but sort of showing that the G20 is the hub. If you are the hub, you have to have some components around the hub, and I think the G20 is showing the ability to do this. The question, of course, is whether it will be able to do this over a longer period, and whether the agenda will be very much reflection of the G20 as a steering committee.
There is still an unfinished agenda, and depends where we want to bring this, how we want to move this process forward. If the G20, as Andy Cooper said, was just a crisis committee, then fine, we can pack up now and go. But if it's more than that, and it's a new tool in the governance of the new economic order, the multipolar economic order, and again, one thing we discovered in our workshop is this is a very complex concept, and sometimes the concept doesn't entirely reflect the reality. But then if this G20 is something more, then we need to move the process forward, and we need to think how we move the process forward, which are the right tools, and again, go back to policy coordination, dig into that kind of, and drill into that kind of concept.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Bali and Copenhagen was, really an important forum. But one thing that we learned on that process, this is the Indonesia's position for that one. We see the issue of this climate change is not as environmental issue per se. It's more on the development issue. And the way we address this issue is not partially just look at, from this environmental perspective, but also related to the issue of this poverty, issue of this, employment. And because in developing countries, you should link this issue, the environmental issue, with the issue of poverty and employment as well. Otherwise, there will be no value added for involving in this environmental issue. So because we look at this issue as the development issue, and the role of this fiscal policy become very important, because we can use this, tax break, the Peruvian tax, the budget issue, the budget mechanism for, helping sort of like defining the policy which is environmental friendly. And in the future, after Bali and Copenhagen, I think it's very important to come up with the real framework that could be implemented, because most discussion is actually rely on financing mechanism through the donors. But we have to understand as well, we cannot only rely on donors country. We should also invite the private sector to participate on this process. And one of the important instrument that you can use is fiscal, is tax, is budget. And I think this is going to be the future, rather than expecting this just aid for adaptation or mitigation. We should go further, and I think that's Indonesia's position related to the issue of this financing and also the way we look at the problem of this climate change.
Chatham, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. When the crisis first broke, so going back to the fall of 2007, I think a number of people anticipated the crisis might coincide with the collapse of confidence in the US dollar. And in fact, it had the opposite effect. A bit curious. And that was because there was a scramble for liquidity, and the main source of liquidity was dollars themselves. And so the crisis, in fact, coincided with renewed interest in acquiring dollars. Now that we're through that kind of liquidity scramble, there are much deeper questions about the dollar's international role. It remains the main currency in the world, despite the fact that the size of the U.S. economy within the world economy has declined over the last 40 years. I think the sense that in the workshop here was that there is a kind of a disequilibrium situation there that needs to be resolved in some way. It's not easily resolved. You can't just announce that you're going to change the world currency system. There's all kinds of inertia, and there's many reasons why the US dollar will remain the world's currency. It's the most liquid currency that you can hold. If you have $2 trillion, as China has, and you're trying to invest it somewhere, very difficult to do that in the euro, whereas the US Treasury bill market is extremely large and liquid market. So there's reasons it will likely remain. And I think the debates are around trying to find some way to supplement the dollar's role, or perhaps ease the transition into a more multi-polar currency order. And that's, I think, where the G20 are increasingly focusing their attention when if at all, they're thinking about international monetary issues.
And you see China, on one hand, okay, we will be very happy to see a new international monetary system, okay, which can have a better protection of the countries like China, as developing world countries. They are more vulnerable to the fluctuation of international monetary markets. But on the other hand, okay, China now has developed so much reliance on the US dollars by the accumulating so huge amount of US dollars in hands. Okay, China would like to see depreciations of the US dollars. Okay, that means we would like to see such a dollar-based IMS. It goes forward for some time. It will give the world time, okay, to find a good way of the soft landing to transit to a new international monetary system. Okay, that is some kind of paradox, okay, in China's considerations.
Well, I think it's probably without doubt that we are going to see another boom and bust. I think if we were trying to eliminate boom bust, we don't have the necessary measurements and calibrations to do that. But that's not to say we can't do something and we can't moderate the booms. The size of the crash is correlated with the size of the boom. They're not identical, but they're related. So if we can minimize and mitigate the booms, something that Alan Greenspan thought could not be done, if we can do that, I think we will then minimize the crashes. There are also things we can do to try and contain the crashes so that so a crisis doesn't spill over into a catastrophe. And there's much work being done at G20 and at the FSB and at Basel on improving market functioning, requiring clearing and settlement for financial instruments, for example.